In the autumn of 1878, a farmer working a dry creek bed in western Arkansas felt his plow blade strike something solid. He assumed it was a root. It turned out to be a rifle. A Sharps carbine, standard military issue. Its stock was charred from an old fire. Its barrel, warped by heat, was still wrapped in the decaying remnants of a cotton sack, its inner seam stitched with 11 names in thread the color of rust. 9 of those names had previously appeared on federal death warrants filed at the Fort Smith courthouse, just across the state line. The remaining 2 had disappeared from every census, tax roll, and church ledger in the Indian Territory, as if the earth had swallowed them without a trace. That same afternoon, the farmer brought both the rifle and the sack into town and placed them on the desk of the federal marshal. Within 48 hours, the rifle vanished. The farmer's sworn statement vanished. And the name stitched at the very bottom of the cotton sack, underlined 3 times in the same rust-colored thread, vanished along with them. For nearly a century, no serious historian would admit that name could belong to a woman. When the truth finally emerged, buried in the private correspondence of a court clerk, opened by a descendant in 1962, it carried a detail so unsettling that the Arkansas Historical Society, after 2 closed-door meetings and a formal vote, elected not to release it. The file remains sealed to this day. Before we proceed with the tale of the woman the Choctaw Trails came to call Nanyehi, meaning sparrow, the only bounty hunter on the American frontier, whose very name made outlaws bury their weapons and flee toward the Mexican border, do me a small favor. Subscribe to this channel so you won't miss any of these forgotten narratives. And in the comments, let me know what state, country, or city you're listening from right now. I'm always amazed by how far these stories reach, and I read every single comment. To grasp what this woman accomplished, and why the records are so deliberately fragmented, you first need to understand the landscape she operated within, the region between the Arkansas River and the Red River in the post-Civil War years was not a state. It was not, in any legal sense, part of America. It was the Indian Territory, a sprawling expanse of unorganized land, now roughly eastern Oklahoma, set aside by treaty for the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations after the forced relocations of the 1830s. Because it wasn't a state, state law didn't apply. Because tribal courts held jurisdiction only over their own citizens, any non-tribal individual, not a federal soldier, could commit murder in broad daylight on a creek road and walk away without fear of any sheriff. Every outlaw, deserter, horse thief, counterfeiter, bigamist, arsonist, and fugitive killer east of the Rockies was well aware of this. They had known since the war's end. By 1870, the territory had become the largest refuge for criminals on the continent, a 70,000 square mile region with a white fugitive population the federal marshal's office estimated at over 20,000 men. The only law that pursued these men was the United States Marshal Service, operating out of the federal court in Fort Smith, Arkansas, under Judge Isaac Parker, a hanging judge who, over his 21-year tenure, would sign the death warrants for 79 men and preside over more than 13,000 cases. To enforce Parker's writs across the territory, the marshals relied on a unique group of contracted riders called deputy marshals, about 200 at any time, and below them an even rougher class. Freelance bounty hunters paid per living body delivered to the Fort Smith jail, and per corpse with verifiable identification matching the warrant. The pay was $2 per arrest, plus 10 cents per mile, plus a share of any specific reward attached to the fugitive's warrant. Most bounty hunters in the territory were down on their luck. Confederate cavalrymen, Chickasaw freedmen familiar with the backcountry, Cherokee veterans of the Union Indian Home Guard, still able to ride hard, or former outlaws who had struck deals with Parker's court to hunt their old associates for money. The average bounty hunter of that era lasted about 4 seasons before being killed or crippled. Almost none survived a full decade, and nearly every single one was a man. The woman the Choctaw Trails called Nanyehi fit none of these categories. She was born into slavery in the Mississippi bottomlands around 1840. She escaped in the autumn of 1864, while Sherman's army was sweeping through Georgia 600 miles east. She crossed the Mississippi on a stolen flatboat that winter of her freedom, and by the spring of 1869, she was living alone in a one-room cabin on the border of the Choctaw Nation and Arkansas, a Sharps carbine across her knees, a pair of Remington Army revolvers in a flour sack beside her bed, and a leather cord around her neck holding 7 small bone beads. How she traveled from a Yazoo County cotton field to that border cabin, and what she did after arriving, is the question this story seeks to answer. It is not a comfortable question, and the answer, as far as surviving records allow us to piece together, is not a comfortable one. On the Carrick plantation ledger, her name was Hester. No surname was recorded, as the Carrick people were not given surnames in the plantation books. The plantation was situated along the Yazoo River bottomland, about a day's ride northwest of Vicksburg, owned by the Carrick family. Its patriarch, Thomas Carrick, had by the 1860 census enslaved 163 human beings. Hester was 13 when she first appeared in the Carrick inventories as a field hand, valued at $400. She was 24 when those inventories ceased in the summer of 1864. They stopped because by then Thomas Carrick had fled south to Alabama with his 2 unmarried daughters, a wagon of silver, and the plantation Bible, leaving behind an overseer named Abner Gossett with full authority over the property and the 156 people still on it. Abner Gossett was the sort of man whose reputation doesn't survive in the polite histories written by his grandchildren, but does survive vividly and horrifically in the Works Progress Administration slave narratives from the 1930s. 3 former Carrick people, interviewed independently across 3 states over 2 years, described Gossett in nearly identical language. He was a small man, no taller than 5'6", with thinning pale red hair, light red eyelashes, skin that burned easily, and a habit of smiling, a quiet, almost patient smile, when issuing orders that would cause suffering. He kept a pack of 6 dogs, trained from puppies to track runaways, and he had taught the lead dog to hold a grown man by the throat without biting down. He carried a leather-handled braided whip, which he called, without any sense of blasphemy, the preacher, and used with what one interviewed woman called a terrible patient steadiness, as if reading a sermon aloud verse by verse. He also kept his own ledger, separate from the plantation books, recording the punishments he administered and the names of those he had, in his words, corrected. Hester's name appeared in that ledger more than any other. We know this not from the ledger itself, which was burned around 1865, but from the testimony of Rhoda Green, Hester's half-sister through their shared mother. In the spring of 1937, at age 91, Rhoda sat on her granddaughter's back porch in Memphis, Tennessee, and spoke for 4 hours into a WPA interviewer's microphone. The interviewer's typed transcript, now at the Library of Congress, runs to 47 pages. 41 pages are about Abner Gossett. The remaining 6 concern what Hester did the night she left. It was the 2nd week of September 1864. The cotton was harvested. The war was 16 months from its end, though no one on the Yazoo River knew that yet. That afternoon, Gossett had ordered 3 men publicly flogged in the yard for stealing corn from the crib. By nightfall, they were locked inside the crib itself, a stone-walled, windowless building with a single heavy door, no water, and no treatment for their back wounds. One of the 3 was Hester's younger brother, a young man of about 19. Recorded only as Cass in the plantation ledger. According to Rhoda Green, the moon was nearly full that night, but heavy clouds moved in from the southwest. Hester waited silent, not eating supper, not lying down, until the cloud bank covered the moon shortly before 2 a.m. Then she stood. She removed her shoes to avoid noise on the boards. She walked barefoot, carrying nothing, across the plantation yard, through the kitchen garden, to the side door of the main house, where Abner Gassett slept alone in a ground-floor bedroom. His wife had left him 3 years earlier for her mother's people in Tennessee. She did not speak. She did not scream. According to Rhoda Green, she didn't even breathe hard. What she did to Gassett in the next minutes, and with what instrument, the WPA interviewer Lemuel Cross declined to fully transcribe. The transcript at that point contains only a note in Cross's handwriting. Subject became distressed. Conversation paused 14 minutes, followed by a single resumed sentence in Rhoda Green's voices. She left him where he could be found, but not where he could be helped. Hester then walked back to the corn crib, broke the iron hasp with the long iron bar Gassett had used to bar the door earlier, carried her brother out on her back. He could no longer walk or stand, and laid him gently under a pecan tree on the yard's edge, where a woman named Delphia was waiting in the dark with a stoneware jug of sweet water and a poultice of chewed tobacco leaves and lard for his wounds. Hester did not stay. She didn't even kiss her brother goodbye. She took Gassett's revolver, his boots, and his thoroughbred horse from the stable and rode north through the cane. By first light, she was in the Yazoo swamp. By the following night, she reached the Union Army picket line outside Vicksburg, where a young corporal in the 47th Illinois Volunteer Infantry would later write to his wife that a colored woman on a fine thoroughbred horse had emerged from the cane at dusk, a pistol in her belt, with the calmest face he had ever seen. The corporal wrote that the woman said her name was Hester, that she was 24, that she was not going back, and that she wouldn't say goodbye to her brother, because she feared she wouldn't be able to leave. The corporal's letter, preserved at the Illinois State Historical Library in Springfield, is the first U.S. document in which Hester appears as a free woman. It is also the last in which she appears under that name. From the Vicksburg picket line, she moved north with Union supply trains, working her passage in exchange for food and shelter. By the winter of 1865, she reached Cairo, Illinois, at the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi. There she worked as a laundress in a boarding house for Union officers. And there, according to 2 references in the quartermaster records of the 13th Army Corps at the National Archives in Washington, she also served unpaid as a tracker and scout for a Union cavalry detachment under Captain Winthrop Haight. Captain Haight was a Vermonter, a Dartmouth graduate, who kept a daily diary from the war's start until his death in 1888. His diaries were recovered from his family estate in 1951 and donated to the University of Vermont. 3 entries, and only 3, mention Hester. On February 11, 1865, Haight writes that the colored woman H brought in 2 deserters from the 27th Missouri before sundown, unaided, without firing, asking only for a pair of Army issue boots in her size, which he provided. On March 3, 1865, he writes a single sentence, "She can read sign the way a Methodist reads scripture." In the final entry, dated April 19, 1865, 5 days after Lincoln's assassination and 10 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Haight writes at length. He records that H came to him at dawn, already dressed for the road, horse saddled, and asked to be formally released from her informal service. He asked where she intended to go. She told him, in words he quotes directly, that she was going to find the man Gassett, whom she had left at Carrick the previous September, and who, She had just learned from a freedman passing through Cairo, had not died of his wounds. He had been found by a Confederate field doctor on the road out of Vicksburg, nursed back from the brink over the winter of 1864-65, and had since spring joined a Confederate guerrilla band operating in the borderlands between southern Arkansas and the Indian Territory under a false name. Captain Haight wrote that he spent nearly an hour trying to dissuade her. He reminded her the war was ending, the country exhausted, that a colored woman riding alone into that country would have no legal protection, no friend to bury her, no witness to speak her name. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She listened until he finished, thanked him for the boots and the horse, and walked out into the cold gray light. He never saw her again, which brings us to the Indian Territory, and the 5 years of her life from spring 1869 to autumn 1874, about which we know simultaneously the most and the least, and certainly the most disturbing details. Between those dates, a woman, matching her description, appeared sporadically in the records of the federal court at Fort Smith. Always at a distance, never directly. She never testified in open court. She never signed any document. She never collected payment in person from any federal officer. Her bounties were received entirely through an intermediary, a Choctaw freedman named Isham Folsom, who had served in the Union Indian Home Guard during the war and, by the late 1860s, had settled on a small farm at Scullyville, quietly supplementing his income as her banker and liaison with the marshals. The court clerk's ledgers show that, over those 5 years, bounty payments totaling $4.611.227 were paid to Isham Folsom on warrants served by, in the clerk's consistent phrasing across more than 30 entries, the colored female tracker known as Nanyehi. That was an immense sum for the period, roughly a skilled tradesman's lifetime earnings. It represented the capture or killing of at least 31 federal fugitives. She operated alone, without a partner, posse, or backup. She rode a succession of horses, never keeping one longer than a season, knowing a horse was the first thing an outlaw would recognize on a trail. And she wore, according to 3 surviving eyewitness accounts, a long man's wool coat dyed black with walnut hulls to dull the shine, a wide, brimmed black felt hat pulled low, heavy brogan boots, and around her neck, beneath the coat, a thin leather cord from which hung 7 small, notched bone beads. No account ever shows her without that cord. Among the territory's outlaws, the whispered rumor was that the beads represented the 7 men she was still hunting. She didn't take men she wasn't hunting, and she brought them in alive when possible, far more often than her male counterparts. She accepted the lower bounty rather than delivering a corpse. But when it came to one of the 7, she didn't bring him in alive. She didn't bring him in at all. When she found one of the 7, the body was never recovered. The horse would wander into a settlement days later. The cabin would be undisturbed. The trail would simply stop, and a single filed bone bead would be left at the scene, smooth and pale against the dark ground. The first of the 7 to be struck from her list was a Missouri guerrilla named Jubal Creech, who had ridden with Quantrill's raiders, had been at the 1863 Lawrence Massacre, according to sworn depositions, and had joined the same Arkansas Indian Territory brush band as Abner Gossett in the summer of 1865. Creech wasn't found, rather, he wasn't found. In spring 1870, on the Pine Mountain Trail north of the Kiamichi River, his horse walked into a Choctaw settlement 3 days later, saddlebags intact, rifle in scabbard, canteen full, and a single smooth filed bone bead wedged into the saddle stitching, placed where anyone unsaddling the animal would find it. The Choctaw light horseman who examined the horse said the bead was a message, though they wouldn't say to whom, from whom, or what it meant. The second of the 7 was a Cherokee freedman, turned horse thief named Wiley Spann, who had joined Gossette's band in 1866 after his own father was hanged for stealing a judge's mule. Spann had developed a particular reputation for violence against women. Spann vanished in winter 1871 from a remote log cabin on Black Fork Creek's North Branch between one evening and the next morning. When deputy marshals arrived 4 days later, the cabin was undisturbed, coffee pot on the cold stove, boots by the door, pipe on the table beside a dog-eared Tahlequah newspaper, and on the table, centered on a square of clean white paper, a single filed bone bead. And beneath the bead, in a careful schoolroom, hand described by several as unusually beautiful, were the names of 3 women and 2 children. A missionary schoolteacher in Tahlequah later identified the names as corresponding exactly to 5 Carrick plantation people. 3 adult women and 2 young children, sold away from the plantation in 1861, separated from families and never seen again. Wiley Spann himself appeared in the surviving bill of sale as the buyer's agent who had arranged their transport south. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th of the 7 fell in quick succession through summer and autumn 1872. In circumstances I won't detail fully here, except to note that in each case, a filed bone bead was left where the body should have been. That in each case, the man had confessed to some priest, friend, or drinking companion to having been present at Carrick during a specific documented act of cruelty against Hester's mother, whose name in the 1854 Carrick inventory was recorded as Tempe. And that in each case, the trail followed by deputy marshals, sometimes for days, simply ended at a riverbank, sinkhole, or cotton field edge, as if the man had walked into the ground and the ground had closed over him. By early spring 1873, the 2 names remaining on Hester's bone cord were Abner Gossett himself, and a man about whom I must warn you. The surviving records are so fragmentary, so deliberately redacted, so carefully and institutionally broken, that we cannot even be sure of his real name. The court clerk, whose private letters to his wife surfaced in spring 1962, when his grandson opened a locked trunk in a Van Buren attic, refers to the 7th man in a letter from early summer 1873 as simply, "the man we do not speak of." He notes with considerable unease that the Fort Smith Marshal's office had received a direct instruction from Washington that June, delivered in person by a senior Interior Department official who had traveled specifically for that purpose, not to issue any warrant for any fugitive associated with a certain federal property in the Indian Territory. He doesn't name the property or the fugitive. He notes only that the instruction troubled him deeply, that he had lost sleep for weeks, and that in his private view, the instruction came because someone in Washington, high enough to send an interior official on a special train across 3 states, was afraid of what a certain colored female tracker would find if she continued riding in the direction she was known to be heading. The court clerk's name was Thaddeus Boole, born in Vermont, educated at a small Presbyterian college in Ohio. He came to Fort Smith as a young man after the war. His letters to his wife, who remained in Ohio during his first 3 years due to ill health, are the single most important primary source on the final phase of Hester's life. They are also the source the Arkansas Historical Society, meeting twice in autumn 1962, voted by majority not to publish. If you're finding this story as unsettling as I am, take a moment to hit the like button below. It genuinely helps these forgotten American stories reach people who would otherwise never hear them. And it tells me to keep digging into the archives for more. If you already have a theory about who the 7th man was or what the Washington instruction protected, drop it in the comments. I read every one. Now, let me tell you what happened next. This is where the hunt turns into something considerably darker, and where the records themselves begin to act strangely, disappearing, reappearing, replaced by versions that don't match. In the high summer of 1873, Hester went silent for 4 months. No payments to Isham Folsom in the Fort Smith ledger from early June through late September. No sightings on the Choctaw trails. No reports of her passage at Arkansas's river ferries, where ferrymen had previously tracked her coat and hat. No whispered rumors in trading posts at McAlester, Atoka, or Eufaula. She simply vanished for 4 consecutive months in the middle of her most active year. The silence ended on October 14, 1873, when a Creek Nation Lythorse officer named Pleasant Porter, then 23, later principal chief of the Creek Nation in 1899, rode into Fort Smith with a sealed dispatch for the federal marshal. The dispatch reported that a white man matching Abner Gossett's description had been found 3 days earlier in an abandoned line shack on the North Fork of the Canadian River, about 40 miles west of Eufaula. He had been found alive, bound to a wooden chair with leather saddle straps, a square of paper pinned to his shirt with a sewing needle, bearing in the same careful schoolroom hand only 3 words. Porter's dispatch, preserved in the Fort Smith archives, preserves those words exactly. Not him alone. Beneath them, a small neat sketch of a bone bead, and the bead in the sketch had not been filed smooth. Abner Gossett was brought to Fort Smith under heavy guard. He was tried before Judge Isaac Parker in mid-November 1873 on 6 counts of murder committed during and after the war. He was convicted on 4, sentenced to hang, and hanged on February 7, 1874, at 11 a.m. on the Great Gallows in the federal jail courtyard, before an estimated crowd of 800 people, as reported by the Fort Smith newspaper. In his final statement from the scaffold, recorded by the Fort Smith elevator reporter and printed the following morning, Abner Gossett did not confess, beg, pray, or ask forgiveness from man or God, he said. And the reporter's shorthand preserves this exactly. She should have killed me herself, and she will never forgive herself that she did not. And the man she is still looking for is a worse man than I ever was, and you will never hang him, and you will never even write his name down, because the people who own him own you, too. Those were Abner Gossett's last words. The hangman released the trapdoor. The crowd dispersed. The reporter filed his copy, and Hester, wherever she was that morning, began the final hunt of her life, a hunt that would consume the next 15 months, take her across 3 states, and bring her, at its end, to something she had never expected to find, and that we, reading the records 150 years later, are forced to confront as the thing the Arkansas's Historical Society could not bring itself to publish. The 7th name on Hester's cord, it turns out, was not a name at all. It was a title, and the title, in the surviving margin notes of Thaddeus Boole to his personal copies of the court ledger, was Indian Agent, specifically the federal Indian agent assigned to a particular agency within the Indian Territory between 1855 and 1861, whose official duties included distributing annuity payments to one of the 5 tribes, licensing white traders within that tribe's boundaries, and, most importantly for this story, regulating slavery within the agency's jurisdiction. This last duty existed because at that time the 5 tribes were, in federal law, sovereign slave-holding nations, and the agent's role, therefore, included the official return of runaway slaves who had crossed into the territory from the United States to their legal owners east of the Arkansas River. The agency itself was a real place with real buildings, employees, and account books. It still exists today as an archaeological site on federal land, though the original structures are gone, with only foundations and a single restored outbuilding remaining. The agent was also a real man. His name is known to researchers. It appears in the Department of the Interior appointment rolls for 1855 and in the termination rolls for 1861, when he resigned for reasons described at the time as personal. I have chosen, after consulting with a living descendant of one of the families involved, not to include his full name in this video, because there are still people alive bearing his name and blood who had no part in the things I'm about to describe. What matters for the story is not his name, but what he had done. According to the reconstruction assembled in autumn 1962 by Silas Fry, a retired Fort Smith schoolteacher who spent 3 years reading Thaddeus Boole's letters and referencing them with federal records and plantation purchase ledgers. The agent had run a private business alongside his federal duties between 1855 and 1861. He had used his official powers to identify runaway slaves from southern states who had reached the Indian Territory. He had captured those runaways with a small standing group of 4 or 5 hired men within his agency, and then sold them, not back to their original owners, which would have required paperwork and attention, but to entirely new slaveholders in Texas and Arkansas, pocketing a substantial personal profit he never recorded in any official ledger. The business was illegal under both federal and tribal law, but because of the territory's geography and the near total absence of federal oversight, it was effectively invisible to anyone outside the 4 or 5 men directly involved. Silas Fry, working slowly through 13 boxes of agency records, transferred to the Federal Archive in 1861 and never examined by any historian in the intervening century, identified at least 34 separate individuals taken through the agent's private pipeline in those 6 years. 29 of the 34 names were fully recoverable. One of the 29 names on a bill of sale dated November 17, 1854 was Temp. That was the same Temp who appeared in the Carrick Plantation inventory of January 1855 as a recent purchase from an Indian agency in the Creek Nation for $450. Listed by age, approximate height, and a birthmark on her left shoulder. That was the same Temp who gave birth 9 months later to a girl named Hester. That was the same Temp who died at Carrick in late spring 1858 under circumstances the plantation officially recorded as fever, but that WPA narratives collected 79 years later from 3 separate witnesses describe in terms no serious historian has ever treated as fever. Hester had not known. This is the part of the story that hits hardest, and the hardest to write about calmly. The records we have, fragmentary as they are, strongly suggest that Hester had believed her entire life, from her earliest childhood on the plantation until the late summer of 1873, when she was 33, that her mother had been born at Carrick, lived her whole life there, died there, and had never seen any other ground. What Hester learned in the late summer of 1873, causing her to go silent for those 4 unaccounted months, was that her mother had once, briefly, been free. Her mother was born into slavery on a Macon County, Alabama cotton plantation in 1834. She escaped at 19 in early spring 1853, walking west for 41 nights across Mississippi, Louisiana, and the eastern edge of Texas. She reached the Creek Nation in late summer of that same year. She was alive, free, and safe in the Indian Territory for 10 full months. Then, in early autumn 1854, a federal Indian agent hunted her down inside a Creek freedman's cabin where she was sheltering, put her in a wagon at gunpoint with 3 other captured runaways, drove 180 miles to a Yazoo River plantation landing, and sold her to Thomas Carrick for $450 in gold coin. 9 months later, she gave birth at Carrick to a daughter she named, in a moment no one on the plantation understood at the time, Hester, which in some old traditions is a name given to children who are hoped for, waited for, and carried a long way before arriving. 4 years later, in spring 1858, she was dead. The man who sold her was in late summer 1873 still alive. He was living comfortably on a federal pension under his own name in a small eastern Arkansas town, under the explicit protection of the Washington instruction Thaddeus Boole had noted with such unease. And Hester, in late summer 1873, having finally learned his name from sources the records don't preserve, rode east out of the Indian Territory toward that small Arkansas town to find him. She found him in December. We know this because Dr. Josiah Alden, a Fort Smith physician whose professional casebook, bound in black cloth, survives in the University of Arkansas Library's special collections, recorded on December 17, 1874, that he was summoned at 2 p.m. to a boarding house on the Van Buren Road, about 6 miles from town, to attend a white man suffering from what the doctor described as a gunshot wound to the lower abdomen, inflicted at very close range with a large caliber weapon. The wound, in the doctor's professional opinion, was consistent with a Remington Army revolver fired from less than 6 feet. The doctor also noted a second wound on the same patient, which he declined to describe in detail, writing only that it was a ritual mutilation of such distressing and deliberate character that he would not commit it to writing in any casebook that might be read by another physician or family member. At a later date, the man died on December 19, 1874, at approximately 4 a.m., after 2 days of what the doctor recorded as the most protracted and horrible suffering he had witnessed in 28 years of frontier practice. The doctor's casebook, throughout the entire entry, doesn't record the man's name because, as the doctor notes at the end in a line apparently added later, a sheriff's deputy who arrived at the boarding house late on December 18 had instructed him directly not to record the name under any circumstances, and had returned after the death to take official possession of the body. The boarding house register for that week, recovered in the 1940s from an attic during demolition for a gas station, contained no entry for the room the doctor described. The page had been cleanly torn out along the binding. What the doctor did record, in a margin note on the same page, written in different ink and slightly different handwriting, apparently weeks later and never edited out, was that on the small pine table, beside the dying man's bed on the second morning, while the man was still barely conscious, the doctor saw a single small filed bone bead, smooth as river, washed ivory, and beside it a small square of clean white paper. On the paper, written in a careful schoolroom hand, was the single word, temp. Just that one word, nothing else. And the doctor, Josiah Alden, knew without being told, in a way he couldn't later explain, that he was looking at the end of something that had started long before he arrived at the boarding house, had traveled a great distance, and had, on that cold December morning in a rented room in eastern Arkansas, at last come home. He didn't know the beginning. We do. Hester was not arrested. No sheriff, marshal, or federal officer ever swore a warrant for the death of the man on the Van Buren Road. Because officially, the man had not died. Because officially, he had not been there. Because officially, according to the Washington instruction, he had not existed in the Indian Territory or Arkansas since his 1861 resignation. The instruction had done its work. His pension continued to be paid for another 16 years to a post office box in a different town and state, apparently collected by someone. But Hester did not return to the Indian Territory. She didn't go back to Isham, Folsom's small farm at Scullyville. She didn't collect another bounty from the Fort Smith court. She didn't, as far as any surviving record indicates, ever fire a weapon at anyone for the rest of her life. What she did do, according to the last document mentioning her by any name, was buy a piece of land. The land was 80 acres of cut over timber in a shallow valley in western Arkansas, about 30 miles northwest of Fort Smith and 12 miles from the nearest town. The deed was recorded in the county deed book on March 11, 1875, under the name Hester Alden, the surname apparently borrowed with permission from the doctor who had treated her mother's killer, and who seems, from a single surviving letter in the Alden family papers, to have become in the last weeks of 1874 and the first of 1875 a friend. She paid $160 cash for the 80 acres. She built, with her own hands and occasional help from 2 black carpenters from the nearest town, a small 2-room frame house with a stone chimney and a good well. She planted an orchard of Arkansas's black apple trees. She kept bees, 9 hives by 1878, and she sold the honey in jars at the Saturday market in town. The 1880 federal census records her as a widow, black, approximately 40, farmer, living alone, unable to read or write, which was false, but what she told the census taker. After 1880, the trail goes cold. There is no death record for Hester Alden in the county register. No grave marker in any county cemetery bearing that name. No will on file at the courthouse. The 80 acres, frame house, and apple orchard passed, at some point before 1900, to a small black Methodist church in the county, which held the land as a burial ground for black Civil War veterans and their families. The church still stands today, with about 60 members, the original orchard still bearing fruit each autumn. Whether Hester herself is buried in that orchard under another name, or no name, or whether she simply walked out one morning into the woods and kept walking, we do not know. We may never know. The cotton sack rifle, the Sharps carbine plowed up in the Dry Creek bed in fall 1878, has been conclusively identified by 3 independent American firearms historians over 4 decades as the specific weapon issued from the Union Cavalry Quartermaster's stock at Cairo, Illinois in winter 1865 to a scout attached to Captain Winthrop Haight's detachment. The serial number on the receiver matches the quartermaster's ledger. The 11 names stitched into the cotton sack's inner seam have been matched by painstaking archival comparison to known fugitives of the Indian Territory between 1869 and 1874. In 9 of the 11 cases, the name corresponds exactly to a man known to have been killed or captured by the tracker Nanyehi in those years. In the 10th case, the name matches the man on the Van Buren Road in December 1874. In the 11th case, the name corresponds to no fugitive, soldier, agent, or person of any description ever successfully identified by any researcher in the 148 years since the rifle was plowed up. The stitching around the 11th name is noticeably different from the other 10. Tighter, more recent, a slightly different shade of thread. Some researchers argue the 11th name was added to the sack after March 1875, perhaps years later, representing a person Hester was still hunting at the end of her life, someone she never found, whose identity died with her in the Arkansas hill country. Others argue something else entirely, that the 11th name is one Hester gave herself, the name of the woman she had become, the woman she was forced to become to do what the law and the U.S. government refused to do. On this reading, Hester added her own name last, not intending to kill herself, but because she understood, on some level she couldn't voice, that she had been hunting one more person all along herself. Which reading is correct? We don't know. We will never know. The rifle itself, after being removed from the farmer's hands at the marshal's office in 1878, passed through a succession of federal offices over 13 years, was cataloged at the National Archives in Washington in summer 1891, stored in a locked evidence room in that building's basement, and marked for official disposal in spring 1924. What happened to it after the disposal order? No one can say. It doesn't appear in any subsequent federal inventory, public or private. Just when we thought we'd reached the end, the horror of this story deepens in one final unexpected direction. And it's not the direction you're expecting. If this story has stayed with you, take a moment to share it with a friend who loves forgotten American history. Hit the like button to help the algorithm reach others who need to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Then let's look together at the one final detail, the small detail that made the Arkansas Historical Society close the file in 1962 and leave it closed for 64 years. The detail the society couldn't publish was not about Hester. It was about the agent, Silas Fry, the amateur historian who assembled the dossier in autumn 1962 from Thaddeus Boole's letters, agency records, and scattered testimony, had during his research tracked down a living descendant of the agent's family through genealogy and county probate records. She was a woman in her late 60s, the agent's great-granddaughter, a retired schoolteacher like Fry himself, living alone in a small white frame house in a small southern Arkansas town. Fry wrote to her, explained his research in general terms without revealing the worst, and asked if any family papers survived from her great-grandfather's federal service. She wrote back within a week. There was a trunk in the attic. It had been in the family since the agent's death in 1893. No one had ever opened it, so far as she knew. She invited Fry to come help her open it. Fry drove down on a Tuesday in October 1962. He spent most of Wednesday afternoon sitting with the elderly great-granddaughter on the floor of her overheated attic, going through the trunk piece by piece. Most of what they found was expected family photographs, daguerreotypes, tintypes of men and women in high collars, some named in pencil on the back, some not. Property deeds bundled with ribbon, personal letters tied in packets, a family Bible with births and deaths recorded in two handwritings in the front, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a yellowed pillowcase folded 4 times, was a single small cloth bag about the size of a man's fist, stitched shut with neat black thread. The elderly woman said her mother, who died in 1941, had once told her as a girl of about 9 never to open that bag, without ever explaining why. Silas Fry asked for permission to open it. She hesitated. She asked if he thought it mattered. He said he thought it mattered very much. She gave permission. Fry cut the stitches carefully with a small pair of sewing scissors her mother had left her. He opened the bag. Inside, separated by small squares of yellowed tissue paper so they wouldn't tangle, were 14 locks of human hair. Each lock was tied at one end with a different colored silk ribbon, red, blue, green, black, and others. Each was pinned to its tissue paper with a small brass pin, and each square was labeled in brown ink in the agent's own handwriting with a first name and a date. The earliest date was April 9, 1855. The latest was 22nd, 1861, 14 names, 14 dates, 14 locks of hair. He had kept them for 32 years, from the end of his federal service until his death in 1893, hidden from his wife, his children, every other human being who lived in that house. The 13th name on the list, tied with a black ribbon, on tissue paper dated November 17, 1854, 2 months before her sail to Thomas Carrick on the Yazoo River, was Temp. The elderly great-granddaughter, the retired schoolteacher, had not known. Not any of it. She hadn't known her great-grandfather had trafficked in human beings. She hadn't known the small cloth bag her mother had told her never to open contained what it contained. She hadn't known the names, the dates, that the federal pension she'd grown up hearing mentioned with pride at Sunday dinners had been the pension of a man who sold children for gold. She sat on the attic floor for several minutes without speaking. Then she asked Silas Fry if she could be alone for a few hours. He said, "Of course." He went downstairs and sat on her front porch in the October sun. When he came back up 3 hours later, the small cloth bag was empty. The 14 locks of hair were gone. The tissue paper was gone. The ribbons were gone. She had, she said, given them back. She had taken them in a clean cotton handkerchief, folded 4 times, to a cemetery she happened to know about. A small black Methodist cemetery in a shallow valley in western Arkansas, with old apple trees along its eastern edge, about which she'd read in a county history pamphlet some years earlier. She had gone alone late in the morning, with a garden trowel in her purse. She had asked the groundskeeper for permission to bury something small, not telling him what. And in the corner nearest the apple trees, she had buried the 14 locks of hair under 14 small flat stones she'd gathered from the creek bed on her way in. She had asked to be forgiven, she said, in the name of a great-grandfather she'd never met and a woman whose name she'd only learned that same afternoon. Silas Fry wrote it all down that night in his small hotel room, in the longhand he used for his research notes. It's in the papers he left behind when he died in 1978. The papers the Arkansas Historical Society voted twice in closed meetings not to publish. It's the reason they voted not to publish. The minutes of the second meeting record, in careful language, that they did not feel it was their place to decide whether Hester had forgiven the agent or not. They did not feel they had the moral authority, as an institution, to assert that the matter was closed or open, or had any conclusion beyond the one a private woman, in a private moment in a cemetery she barely knew, had attempted to grant on behalf of another woman she had never met. And so they closed the file. And it remains closed. That is where this story sits today, in a locked cabinet in Little Rock, in the sealed dossier of an amateur historian who died in a nursing home in 1978 and whose children never read his papers, in the margin notes of a federal court clerk who wrote to his wife in Ohio about a woman he never met, but whose passage through his ledgers had transformed the shape of his moral universe over 5 years. The records do not tell us, and probably never will, whether Hester herself ever knew about the locks of hair. Whether she knew at the end of her life, in the frame house in the Apple Valley, that her mother had been kept by her killer as a ribboned relic for 20 years after her death. Whether, on some cold night in the winter of 1890 or 91 or 92, Hester sat on the porch of that small frame house and understood at last that the thing she'd been hunting for 25 years had not been men, had not been a list of names in rust, colored thread on a cotton sack, but a single unbearable fact about the country she was born into and the century she was made to live through, and that her hunt had ended not because all the names had been crossed off, but because the hunter had finally understood what she had been hunting. We do not know. We cannot know. We can only guess, and the guess, when we allow ourselves to make it, carries the weight of every person whose name never made it into a ledger, whose hair was never kept, whose child never learned that her mother had once, for 10 short months in a Creek freedman's cabin in autumn 1853, been free. This story tells us something about the country we live in that our official histories don't like to say plainly. It tells us that justice, when denied by the law and the government, is sometimes taken up in secret by the very people the law and the government have abandoned. And when taken up in that way, it cannot be called justice in any clean sense. But it can't be called anything else either. It tells us that the line between hunter and hunted is not always moral, and that sometimes the only people who can cross that line with clarity are those who have already crossed it once, before in the other direction. It tells us that a woman valued at 400 in a plantation inventory could, within a decade, make the most feared white outlaws on the frontier bury their weapons and run for the Mexican border at the sound of her name. And it tells us, perhaps above all, that when we're told records are lost, or a story can't be confirmed, or a file is closed for reasons of historical delicacy, We should always ask who had the power to decide what was recorded and what was lost, and who's benefited in the years since from the forgetting. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Hester was a murderer, a soldier, a judge, a prophet, or something for which our language still lacks a clean word? Do you believe the Arkansas Historical Society was right to keep the file closed? Or should the agent's name be published at last 150 years later, so the ledger is finally balanced? Leave your comment below. I read every single one, and I argue with some of them. If this story moved you, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who believes the dead still have claims on us. I'll see you in the next video.